November 1945. Okinawa, Japan. The sun had barely pierced the heavy morning fog, and the distant roar of the Pacific crashed against jagged cliffs. The island's landscape was littered with the shattered remnants of war, charred bunkers, twisted steel, and the remnants of last month's artillery barges. Japanese soldiers, weary from months of combat and supply shortages, crouched in the underbrush, rifles trembling in their hands, eyes scanning for threats that never seemed to end. They had been conditioned to expect cruelty from the Americans, with stories of bayonets, flamethrowers, and merciless airstrikes etched into their collective imagination. And yet, on this morning, something utterly incomprehensible unfolded. As the first American medical teams emerged from the mist, carrying stretchers and field kits, the Japanese soldiers froze. Smoke from earlier skirmishes mingled with the salty ocean air, acrid and choking, but there was no gunfire aimed at them. Instead, nurses and doctors moved swiftly among the wounded, their white coats stark against the gray battlefield, voices calm, firm, and precise. The medics treated burns, gunshot wounds, and infections with methods and supplies the Japanese had never seen in combat. Soap, clean bandages, and antiseptics, all carefully organized, distributed, and applied. The enemy, trained to expect death at the hands of Americans, now saw something that seemed almost alien: compassion. Nearby, a corporal from the U.S. Army Medical Corps, assigned to the 77th Infantry Division, worked tirelessly alongside Japanese prisoners, applying morphine to a soldier whose leg had been mangled by shrapnel. Sweat rolled down the corporal's temple, stinging his eyes as he adjusted the tourniquet. His hands, calloused from years of handling rifles and equipment, now moved with the meticulous care of a surgeon. Field reports from the day described the stunned silence among Japanese ranks, whispers of disbelief passing through their lines. They had been trained to fear annihilation, to expect torturous treatment if captured. And yet, here were Americans giving what they had been denied even by their own supply-starved officers: care, food, and human dignity. The broader context of this humanitarian paradox lies in the shifting strategy of the U.S. Army by late 1945. Across the Pacific, the Americans had developed an approach to prisoner management rooted not in vengeance, but in efficiency and morality. Influenced heavily by the Geneva Conventions and by officers like Colonel William H. Houghton, who had spent years studying battlefield medicine and prisoner welfare. On Okinawa alone, over 12,000 Japanese soldiers were estimated to surrender in the final weeks of combat, many suffering from malnutrition, dysentery, and untreated injuries. Commanders recognized that maintaining order and morale among these prisoners required a radical departure from the instinct to brutalize. Instead, medical staff, trained in rapid triage, nutrition restoration, and psychological reassurance were embedded within advancing units. For the Japanese, this treatment created a cognitive dissonance as immediate and powerful as any artillery salvo. Accounts from U.S. after-action reports describe soldiers being questioned repeatedly about the Americans' intentions, unable to reconcile their own indoctrination with the tangible care they were receiving. "We thought they would kill us. We expected knives and fire," one soldier later confessed in a quiet interrogation, his hands trembling as he recounted being offered a warm meal and clean water. Another, lying on a stretcher as his comrades were bandaged and fed, whispered to himself in disbelief, "They are not our enemies. They are healers." The contrast between expectation and reality was sharpened by the methods and tools used. Portable field hospitals, designed by engineers at the U.S. Army's Office of the Surgeon General, allowed medical teams to set up treatment stations mere meters from active gunfire. Aluminum-framed tents with antiseptic-treated canvas could be deployed within hours, stocked with morphine, sulfa powder, and bandages manufactured by Johnson & Johnson and Baxter Laboratories. Dr. William W. Keene, an Army medical planner, had overseen protocols for these rapid response units, ensuring that even in the chaos of battle, hygiene, triage, and basic care were uncompromised. The Japanese, many of whom had experienced only starvation and shellfire in the weeks prior, found the sight of organized, methodical aid almost surreal. Beyond the immediate shock, there was the tactile and visual evidence of care. Soldiers' wounds were washed meticulously, maggots removed, and broken limbs splinted with precision. Nurses handed out hot tea and rice, rationed from supplies parachuted in by the 11th Airborne Division's logistical teams. Radios crackled overhead with operational updates. Yet the field hospitals remained calm islands of order amid the roiling chaos of artillery exchanges. One young medic, Private First Class Margaret Haynes, later recounted, "I could see fear in their eyes, but also something else. A flicker of hope. It was the first time they'd been treated like humans in weeks." This strategy had a tactical underpinning as well. The Allies knew that treating prisoners well could yield intelligence, cooperation, and reduce the likelihood of sabotage or insurrection. Engineers, logisticians, and military psychologists had worked together to optimize the flow of medical supplies, establishing semi-permanent supply chains across the Okinawan terrain. Trucks from the Red Ball Express equivalent in the Pacific ensured consistent deliveries, while improvised field refrigeration units kept perishable rations and medicines viable even under relentless sun and torrential rain. By combining care with operational foresight, the Americans created a scenario in which humane treatment became both a moral and strategic weapon. Yet, for the Japanese soldiers, every interaction was filtered through years of indoctrination. Soldiers recounted feeling a vertigo of disbelief. "We expected screams and blood. Instead, we received blankets and bandages." Some refused aid at first, suspicious of traps or hidden weapons. Others collapsed into tears of exhaustion and relief. One group, discovered in a camouflaged cave, had survived weeks with minimal rations. When handed water and penicillin, they simply stared at the medics, unable to articulate the sudden, inexplicable reversal of expectations. U.S. medics, accustomed to the rigors of war, responded with patient reassurance. Their discipline unshaken by the enemy's wariness, the psychological impact rippled through the battlefield. Combat-hardened Japanese units, trained to believe that surrender equated to dishonor and inevitable death, were confronted with a reality that challenged their very understanding of enemy conduct. For the first time, many began to question the narratives fed by Imperial command. The Americans' methodical care, combined with relentless operational efficiency, produced a confusion so profound it rivaled the shock of artillery barges or kamikaze attacks. Reports from the 77th Division note repeated observations of utter bewilderment among captured soldiers, their eyes scanning medics' faces as though seeking hidden malice amid the backdrop of shattered villages, smoldering bunkers, and rain-slicked cliffs. These moments of compassion played out like cinematic contrast. The whine of approaching aircraft, the distant detonation of artillery, and the groan of injured men formed a chaotic symphony. Yet within that turmoil, Americans administered care with unwavering precision. Stretchers were carried over muddy slopes, bandages changed under intermittent gunfire, and hot meals delivered despite the ever-present threat of counterattack. Engineers and logistics officers ensured that supplies kept pace with the advance, their work invisible but indispensable, sustaining the medics' capacity to act decisively and humanely. As the day drew on, patterns emerged. Entire units of Japanese soldiers began to cooperate, quietly accepting treatment and food. Soldiers who had expected brutality now found themselves reliant on the Americans for survival. The irony was palpable. Those trained to fight to the death were learning to trust the enemy in order to live. Correspondence from the 77th Division notes, their hesitation gave way to compliance, yet eyes still betrayed disbelief. They could not reconcile mercy with the legends of American cruelty. And yet, this was only the beginning. The story of American care on Okinawa, of shock, disbelief, and eventual reluctant trust, would set the stage for a revelation that even the most seasoned Japanese officers could never anticipate, a factor that would redefine the battlefield itself, turning expectation on its head and altering the course of surrender and survival in ways that textbooks had scarcely imagined. As the sun dipped behind the misty cliffs, shadows stretching over mud-slicked trenches, the medics continued their work, unaware that the very act of kindness was becoming a silent, decisive weapon. The Japanese soldiers had expected cruelty, but what they received instead was a meticulous, unyielding compassion that defied every expectation. And yet, Lurking just beyond the fog of war was an even greater secret, one that would soon be revealed to both sides, challenging assumptions about power, survival, and the true face of American warfare. November 1945. The fog hung heavier now over Okinawa, a gray shroud that seemed to muffle even the distant thunder of retreating artillery. Beneath it, the Americans were revealing a hidden advantage that would shock their enemies: the power of organization, logistics, and medical innovation, a trifecta that turned compassion into a battlefield weapon. The secret lay not just in the visible care of medics, but in the precise coordination behind it, a web of engineers, technicians, and planners who had reimagined the art of sustaining life amid death. The heart of this transformation were the portable field hospitals, marvels of military engineering conceived by Dr. William W. Keene and the teams at the Office of the Surgeon General. Lightweight aluminum frames, antiseptic-treated canvas, and modular interiors allowed a hospital to be erected in hours on terrain previously deemed inaccessible. Within these tents, medics had at their disposal morphine, sulfa powder, bandages, and the newly developed penicillin, supplied by factories such as Pfizer and Merck, which had scaled production tenfold to meet wartime demands. Every stitch, every tube-off medicine, and every sterilized instrument was part of a system that ensured that even in the chaos of shell fire, wounded men could be stabilized, treated, and kept alive. The Japanese, watching from their crumbling positions, could not comprehend this invisible machinery. They had endured weeks of starvation, dysentery, and infections, and the sudden appearance of order, cold, methodical, and unrelenting, felt like sorcery. They moved like ghosts through the smoke, one officer whispered, eyes wide as stretcher-bearers traversed mud-choked paths with surgical precision. Entire units were stabilized faster than the Japanese had ever believed possible, creating a ripple of disbelief that would echo throughout the remainder of the campaign. This medical advantage was intertwined with another, equally decisive factor: the Allies' mastery of supply chains. Trucks, amphibious landing craft, and even cargo planes worked in concert to ensure that frontline medics never ran dry. Engineers in the Pacific Logistics Command had devised a system of floating depots, refrigeration units, and rapid resupply protocols that accounted for terrain, tides, and weather conditions. One notable innovation was the mobile refrigeration units built by Carrier Corporation engineers, which preserved perishable rations and antibiotics under brutal tropical heat. Soldiers who had gone weeks without fresh food now received hot meals and ice-cold water, a psychological shock as potent as any artillery barrage. This dual advantage of care and supply manifested vividly in the Battle of Chinen Ridge. On November 18, 1945, elements of the 77th Infantry Division advanced under a low-hanging mist, approaching Japanese fortifications that had been thought impregnable. The ridge was strewn with natural cave networks, camouflaged bunkers, and interlocking machine gun nests. The Americans, however, approached with a combination of firepower, reconnaissance, and, crucially, medical and logistical preparation that the Japanese had never encountered. Engineers had cleared paths for stretcher teams, established concealed triage points, and even rigged improvised bridges to allow the rapid evacuation of wounded men. As the attack unfolded, Japanese defenders opened fire, expecting the usual tactics of frontal assault, destruction, and annihilation. Instead, they encountered a pattern of advance designed not just to neutralize resistance, but to preserve life where possible. Medics moved alongside riflemen and engineers, extracting casualties even under machine gun fire. Reports from the field described Japanese soldiers lowering their weapons in disbelief as Americans carried wounded comrades, treating them with morphine and bandages before returning to fight. The precision of this coordination, its almost surgical execution amid chaos, created a psychological pressure far exceeding that of bullets or shells. Technical specifications amplified the effect. Stretcher teams used collapsible litter frames weighing under 15 kilograms, allowing 2 men to transport heavily wounded soldiers without slowing the advance. Field hospital tents were equipped with mobile kerosene generators producing 2 kilowatts of power, enough to run sterilizers and lighting. Radios built by Motorola, tuned to secure frequencies, coordinated the movement of supplies and medics across terrain spanning several kilometers. Every innovation, from lightweight aluminum splints to precision tourniquets developed by Army engineers, was calibrated to sustain life with a speed and reliability the Japanese could neither anticipate nor disrupt beyond the battlefield. Psychological operations amplified the advantage. Leaflets, dropped from C-47 transport planes, informed Japanese troops of humane treatment awaiting surrendering soldiers. Post-war interviews confirmed that these messages, combined with the visible evidence of care, created hesitation, confusion, and eventually compliance. "We were taught that surrender meant death," a soldier later recalled. "But when they handed me water and a bandage, I did not know whether to believe it or die trying." This convergence of logistical brilliance and visible compassion undermined the enemy's doctrine of fear, turning the act of surrender into a tactical inevitability rather than a last resort. One particularly stark example occurred on the slopes near Kanishi Ridge, where a Japanese platoon had been cut off for days. As American units approached, medics prepared triage stations with stretchers, sulfa packets, and morphine doses, while engineers reinforced bridges and cleared debris from paths. Japanese soldiers, expecting immediate death, were instead greeted with calm voices, medical attention, and warm meals. Reports from the U.S. 77th Division described the soldiers' disbelief, documenting that nearly half of the isolated unit surrendered peacefully, their shock compounded by the simultaneous presence of firepower and care. This coordination was not spontaneous. Behind the scenes, the U.S. Army had developed intricate planning charts, supply matrices, and field hospital protocols that had been tested in previous Pacific campaigns. Officers like Colonel Houghton and engineers at the Detroit Arsenal had spent months designing modular systems that could be deployed under combat conditions. From the initial design of tents and transport vehicles to the rationing of morphine and penicillin, every element was a product of deliberate engineering, research, and foresight. Field medics, often under direct fire, were supported by invisible layers of preparation that ensured their ability to act decisively, swiftly, and humanely. Enemy reports highlight the cumulative effect. Japanese officers recorded bewilderment at the Americans' ability to both fight and sustain life simultaneously. "They are killing us, yet feeding us. They are wounding us, yet saving our lives. It is impossible," wrote one in a field diary. This duality, ferocity and care, destruction and preservation, confounded traditional military logic and forced Japanese commanders to re-evaluate defensive strategies under conditions they had not been trained to navigate. By the end of November, the combination of portable hospitals, innovative logistics, and psychological operations had reshaped the Okinawan battlefield. Casualty rates among surrendered Japanese units dropped dramatically. Operational efficiency among U.S. troops improved, and morale, both among medics and combat units, was bolstered by the visible impact of their work. Engineers, supply officers, and medical teams operated as an integrated system, their contributions invisible yet decisive, turning compassion into a strategic tool that reshaped both the tactical and human dimensions of war. As night fell, fog crept like a spectral tide over the ridge, and the Americans consolidated positions, medics continuing their rounds under dim lantern light. Japanese soldiers, now under temporary custody, were fed, treated, and observed, their shock giving way to reluctant cooperation. And yet, beneath the surface, another layer of advantage was waiting to reveal itself, a hidden mechanism of coordination, technology, and psychological insight that would ensure that the Americans' edge on Okinawa was not just tactical, but transformational, setting the stage for operations that would ripple far beyond this single island. The secret of survival, of power through care, had only begun to unfold, and the next chapter would expose a dimension of ingenuity and planning the Japanese could never have imagined, a factor that would redefine their expectations of what an enemy could and should do. By early December 1945, the fog of Okinawa had lifted, revealing the full scope of the Americans' hidden advantage, a fusion of engineering, medical science, and psychological mastery that had transformed the battlefield into a theater not only of destruction but of disciplined preservation. The Japanese, previously primed to anticipate cruelty, now faced a reality that defied every assumption, an enemy capable of relentless offense while simultaneously nurturing life. This duality would have enduring strategic and psychological repercussions, reshaping the course of surrender, occupation, and the broader understanding of warfare itself. The immediate strategic impact was visible in the rapid stabilization of surrendered Japanese units. Approximately 12,000 soldiers, many debilitated by malnutrition, infections, and untreated injuries, were processed through a network of portable hospitals, field kitchens, and sanitation units. Engineers had devised temporary water purification systems using chlorine filtration and pump assemblies, ensuring safe drinking water for prisoners and medics alike. Generators maintained sterile conditions for surgical instruments, while refrigeration units preserved both medications and rations. This meticulous care, sustained day after day, drastically reduced mortality rates. In contrast, previous campaigns had witnessed catastrophic losses among surrendered enemy soldiers, due not to combat, but to disease and neglect. By integrating life preservation into the operational plan, the Americans achieved a dual effect. They preserved manpower while destabilizing the enemy's morale and expectations. Psychologically, the effect on Japanese prisoners and frontline troops was profound. For soldiers trained to equate surrender with dishonor and death, the experience of receiving food, clean water, and medical attention produced a cognitive dissonance that undermined the very doctrine they had been raised to uphold. Post-war interrogations described Japanese officers questioning their own indoctrination, noting that the Americans do not fit the image of the enemy we were taught to fear. The visible organization and efficiency of the medics, coordinated movements, triage stations operating under fire, precise rationing, conveyed not only competence but also an ethical code that confounded deeply ingrained expectations. In essence, compassion became a weapon, one that disrupted fear-based compliance and created space for cooperation. The engineers, technicians, and medics who enabled this advantage were unsung heroes of the campaign. At the Detroit Arsenal, teams worked to mass-produce modular field hospital components, including aluminum frames, collapsible cots, and sterilization units. At Motorola, radio engineers fine-tuned frequencies for field coordination, ensuring that medics and supply units remained in constant contact despite terrain and interference. Even the carrier engineers who designed mobile refrigeration units contributed directly to the operational impact, preserving perishable rations and antibiotics critical to sustaining both prisoners and combat-ready soldiers. These industrial and technical contributions, often invisible to the front line, were essential in converting the philosophical ideal of humane treatment into a tangible, battlefield-changing reality. The psychological edge extended to the American troops themselves. Soldiers witnessing the effects of their medics' care reported heightened morale and a reinforced sense of purpose. Combat fatigue, normally exacerbated by witnessing suffering among enemy or ally alike, was mitigated by the ability to save lives directly. Lieutenant James Keller, commanding a forward platoon, noted in his diary that seeing a soldier we feared die in our hands, only to be treated and walk away alive, gave us a strange strength. We fought not just for victory, but for life. This dual reinforcement, impacting both enemy and own forces, amplified operational effectiveness in ways that conventional weaponry alone could not achieve. The legacy of these operations on Okinawa extended far beyond the immediate tactical outcomes. Lessons learned in logistics, medical triage, and prisoner management influenced post-war military doctrine, particularly in the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. Cold War planning incorporated mobile medical units capable of rapid deployment alongside combat elements. Anticipating conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, engineers refined the integration of field hospitals with supply chains, communications networks, and armored advances, a model of network-centric warfare decades before the term existed. Even in the Gulf War, portable triage units and rapid resupply methods echoed principles first tested on Pacific battlefields. demonstrating the enduring impact of combining humanitarian care with operational superiority. Moreover, the human cost and contribution of these efforts cannot be overstated. Medics operated under fire, their hands steady as they applied tourniquets and sutures. Engineers navigated treacherous terrain to deliver supplies, often improvising field repairs to vehicles and medical equipment. Logisticians calculated routes, ration allocations, and rotation schedules with mathematical precision, ensuring that every wounded soldier received care in a timely manner. Each role, while distinct, was interdependent. The failure of one could cascade into operational collapse. Collectively, their work transformed moral imperatives into tactical force, demonstrating that discipline and ingenuity could extend life even amid the horrors of war. Axis commanders, observing these developments, often responded with confusion and despair. Reports from captured officers convey disbelief that an enemy could blend offensive aggression with meticulous care. One remark recorded in a field diary captures the sentiment. "We thought cruelty was power, but they wield mercy as a weapon." This recognition, belated and unsettling, forced strategic recalibrations that would echo through post-war analyses, highlighting that operational advantage was no longer solely a function of firepower, terrain, or numbers. It could reside equally in systems, planning, and the ethical execution of force. WWII mid-December. Okinawa had become both a case study in modern operational medicine and a theater of psychological mastery. Casualty evacuation procedures, nutrition programs, and triage systems had proven that sustaining life under combat conditions could shift the momentum of surrender and compliance. Japanese units, initially resistant and suspicious, began to internalize this new reality, choosing survival through cooperation rather than futile resistance. The Americans, meanwhile, maintained operational tempo and troop morale, validating a doctrine in which ethical conduct and logistical excellence became synergistic instruments of war. The culmination of these efforts revealed a profound truth: that warfare is not solely defined by destruction, but by the management of human capacity, both for sustaining one's own forces and for shaping the response of the enemy. The engineers, medics, and logisticians on Okinawa demonstrated that compassion, when systematized and integrated with strategy, could become as decisive as tanks or artillery. Japanese soldiers, forced to confront this reality, experienced a paradigm shift in their understanding of enemy capability, a lesson that would influence surrender patterns, post-war occupation policies, and the evolution of military ethics for generations. The final American units secured Okinawa. Medics continued to move among the surviving Japanese soldiers, attending to wounds, distributing rations, and offering reassurance. Engineers dismantled temporary hospitals, salvaging materials for future deployment, while supply officers logged every ration, medicine, and piece of equipment, ensuring the lessons of logistics were not lost. In the silence that followed the storm of combat, a new narrative emerged, one in which the strength of a military force was measured not solely in destruction, but in its capacity to preserve life, to instill order, and to wield humanity as a strategic tool. The story of Okinawa's hidden advantage would resonate far beyond the island, shaping post-war doctrine, informing Cold War strategies, and establishing a precedent for the ethical and operational integration of medical science, engineering, and logistics. The Americans' capacity to combine precision, compassion, and relentless efficiency had turned expectation on its head, leaving the Japanese with a lesson etched in disbelief: that true power can be expressed not only in what is destroyed, but in what is preserved, tended, and saved by the end of the campaign. The lesson was clear: cruelty may terrorize, but care commands. And in the theater of war, mastery of life, through ingenuity, discipline, and compassion, proved as decisive as any barrage of shells or advance of armored columns. Like, share, and subscribe for more World War II stories.